One last thing about the Dakota War that I forgot to mention earlier. I should have mentioned this before I got to the trials. And the trials, by the way, are implied here in this drawing. Here's a little boy identifying one of the Dakotas that he witnessed kill somebody. But Andrew Myrick, the government traitor who reportedly said, "Let them eat grass," he was killed on the first day of the war. And when they found his body, he had grass stuffed down his throat and up his anus. Well, let's briefly see what's going on down in the southern plains at this time. The Comanches, you'll recall, and the Kiowas had signed that non-aggression pact / alliance with the Confederacy. But the Confederacy was not going to be a really big factor west of Oklahoma for very long. In fact, the Confederate Army made an effort to invade New Mexico, hoping to then make their way through to California, and they were repelled by the Union Army in March 1862 at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, which pretty well was the end of Confederate ambitions in the West, at least major ones. So the Union is pretty well in control of the Southwest after that, which means that, as I kind of intimated earlier, the Comanches and their Kiowa allies, who had promised not to be attacking any gray jackets, didn't really have that many gray jackets to contend with, so they just went on their merry way, attacking non-Confederate people. And there were a whole lot of them along the Santa Fe Trail, headed toward Santa Fe. And the Comanches and Kiowa and their Plains Apache allies frequently were making raids and attacking people along that trail. So that by 1864, the U.S. Army sent Kit Carson, Colonel Kit Carson, and his regiment to go on a punitive expedition against the Comanches and Kiowas to sort of try to cut out these raids. And it took them a while because so much of the Union Army was tied up with fighting the Confederates, and in the Southwest they had been tied up with fighting Navajos and Apaches up to this point. And I'll touch briefly on that in a moment. So anyway, Kit Carson was already famous before he became a military commander in the Civil War. He was famous as a fur trapper and explorer and mountain man, and he was well versed in the ways of the Plains Indians. Well, he set off with his men. He had he had 335 soldiers under his command, along with 72 native scouts, Utes and Jicarilla Apaches. He also had 2 artillery pieces, 2 howitzers, which, if you're not familiar with a howitzer, it's kind of like a cannon, except it operates more like a mortar. It's, instead of shooting straight out, it sort of is aimed upward, and it fires like in a trajectory. So he had 2 of those, and he went there into the Texas Panhandle, the area where he had intelligence that a Kiowa village was located, and he attacked that village. And very quickly turned out there were more Kiowa there than he had expected. In fact, he didn't know this at the time, but he was in an area that had several villages, both Kiowa and Comanche. So he's starting to get outnumbered. And so he and his men fall back to the Adobe Walls, which is actually Bent's Fort. Remember, we talked about Bent's Fort, William Bent's trading post. This little, and it was, if you remember the picture, it looked kind of like a fort, but it had been long abandoned, and it was collapsed, and the walls were crumbling. So Carson and his men retreated there, and set up defensive positions within the walls. There was no roof left; the roof was gone, but within the walls of the old trading post. And one corner he made into a field hospital. And just more and more Comanches and Kiowas start showing up. In fact, he was facing at least about 1,400 Comanches, Kiowas, and Plains Apaches. Some estimates had it as high as 3,000, probably closer to the first number, 1,500. But still, you got 400 people, and they've got 1,400. Even though you have superior weaponry, that's not a comfortable position to be in. However, he had manned the defenses in some very smart tactical ways, and his men were able to sustain their fire and hold back the charging Indians. And the howitzers certainly helped, right, lobbing those shells into the midst of the Indians. But they started to realize they were running low on ammunition. The Indians, meanwhile, had figured out that even though it's kind of crumbling, it's still a fort, and they've got cannons in it, and just rushing straight at it, even if you outnumber them, isn't very effective. So they set a prairie fire that the winds were going to be pushing right toward the fort, hoping to burn them out. And this probably would have worked if they weren't dealing with someone who was well versed in their ways of warfare, because Colonel Carson had been expecting that, and he had already set some small fires around the fort, burning off the grass, backfires, so that the large fires that they set never reached the fort. And he used that as cover to retreat and essentially get the heck out of there. The U.S. Army called this a victory. The Comanches and Kiowas called it a victory on their side because they chased them away. And in fact, it was the U.S. Forces that retreated. Ultimately, on the U.S. side, there were 6 men killed and 25 wounded. It was impossible for them to know how many of the Indians on the other side were killed and wounded. They estimated around 60 total casualties, but only recovered one dead body. You have to assume they killed more than one. Probably killed more of the Comanches and Kiowas than they lost. But again, if he had not immediately assessed the situation in that first Kiowa village, realized things were going south and that they needed to quickly fortify, and then had the foresight to set those backfires, we would probably be talking about the Carson Massacre. I think that most cavalry officers during that time period who were sent to serve in the Southwest, most of them not having very much experience in that environment and with those cultures, probably would have been taken unawares and probably would have lost their command and their hair. So, it's really, it was maybe more of a draw, and maybe not, because the American forces did retreat. That would be the last time that the Comanches / Kiowas would be able to make the U.S. military retreat. In the coming decade, there'd be a lot more fighting, and the numbers were going to be on the side of the U.S. Army after the Civil War was over. And by the way, notice this is called the First Battle of Adobe Walls. That implies there's a second, and indeed there will be, and it's even more dramatic than this one. But it happens about 10 years down the road, so we'll get to that one later. Let's talk a little bit about the Apache Wars, or, where the U.S. was concerned, the Apache Wars Round 1. Much of this took place in New Mexico and along the New Mexico-Arizona border into Arizona, which is, of course, not in the Southern Plains, but it is Southern Plains adjacent, and it is going to have some effect on what's going on in the Southern Plains, especially during the Civil War. So let's take another look at this map that we've looked at before that shows the location of various Apache groups. Now, on the upper right there in Oklahoma in brown, PL, that stands for Plains Apache, also known as Kiowa Apache. Those are the ones who had, by this point, for a long time, been allied with the Kiowa and essentially lived with them as an extra Kiowa band, although they maintained their Apache language. The L down there in South Texas is for the Lipan Apache, and they are right there on the edge of the plains. Of course, the Plains Apaches are on the plains. Then you've got the M in green, that's the Mescalero. And as you can see, their territory extended right up a little bit into the Southern Plains. North of them, the J in purple is for Jicarilla. Next to the Mescalero in blue, CH for Chiricahua. The Chiricahua are the ones that really got the most historical press, I guess you could say. Some of the most famous leaders. And then to the west of the Chiricahua, WA, the Western Apache, which are comprised of several bands, including the White Mountain Apaches, the San Carlos Apaches, the Tonto Apaches, and others. So Mescalero, they actually get out onto the plains. Chiricahua, not so much, although those two groups were closely allied often and intermarried often. All right, well, as I mentioned, the Lipan are down there in South Texas. They also, by this time period that we're discussing, had become allies of the Comanches. The Mescalero were not allies of the Comanches and never had been, nor had any of the other surrounding Chiricahua, Jicarilla, and etc. But the Lipan had fought against their Mescalero cousins for a long time, so kind of makes sense that they would side with the Mescalero enemies, the Comanches. And that would be the case until several years after the Civil War, 1869. There was a big campaign against the Lipan Apaches on the Mexican side of the border, and they wound up joining with the Membreno, I think, or maybe it was the Mescalero. Well, that would have been an uncomfortable family reunion, wouldn't it? Anyhow, the Apaches in the desert Southwest, and that's the region where most of this takes place. The Apaches in the desert Southwest, as we talked about some time ago, when the U.S.-Mexican War happened, they were all for the Americans taking over. They didn't like the Mexicans. They didn't like the Mexican government, didn't like Spain before that. And after the U.S. did take over a lot of that territory, for the next 10, 12 years, they got along pretty well with the Mescalero and Chiricahua Apaches there in southern New Mexico. It wasn't until the early 1860s, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, that some serious issues arose. Now, there had been sporadic raids by Apache bands on settlers, and in this case, a farmer's 12-year-old son was captured by a band of Apaches, and he wanted his son back, and the U.S. Army officer in charge demanded a meeting with one of the Chiricahua leaders, Cochise, whom he accused of being responsible for the disappearance of this boy. And in reality, he was not. It was a completely different band. But Cochise came in with several other of his men under a flag of truce, which, as we've seen, not always a good idea. when you're dealing with the U.S. Army and you're native. Anyway, came in under a flag of truce. The officer in charge, his name was Bascom, insisted that that Cochise turn over the captive, and Cochise explained he had no captive. At which point, this is kind of like what happened at the Council House fight with the Comanches in Texas. At that point, the U.S. Army, the soldiers there, informed the Chiricahua Apaches that they were under arrest for the kidnapping of this boy. Cochise was standing. They met in a tent, not in a teepee, but in a military tent. Cochise was standing near the canvas wall of the tent, and he took out his knife and slashed a slit into the canvas and made his escape. But the other Chiricahuas who were with him didn't get away, and some of them were his relatives, and they were executed, which is not a good way to win friends and influence people. Now, the U.S. Army was going to have the Chiricahua Apaches on them in a big way. And as it turned out, this was 1861. Right after that, those U.S. soldiers were pulled out because, the Civil War is going on. That campaign in New Mexico that would end up the following spring at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, that was on. So the soldiers were withdrawn, leaving the settlers in the area defenseless right after they had ticked off the Apaches. So this was the beginning of more than a decade of war between the U.S. Army and the Chiricahua Apaches. Cochise, we've already talked about. His father-in-law, Mangus Colorados, which is Spanish for red sleeves, was a very highly respected leader. And a couple of years into this war, he was talked into coming in under a flag of truce to talk to one of the army officers, who then had him arrested and put under guard. And the guards beat him and tortured him with bayonets that they had stuck in the fire to get red hot, and jabbed him with those. And when he moved, they shot him for attempting to escape, and then cut his head off and displayed it. So that did not endear them to Cochise either. Some of these other names over to the right were prominent Apache leaders and warriors. Chato was one. He was sort of one of Cochise's lieutenants. Another one, and his name is bigger like Cochise's because he's more famous, Geronimo, a Chiricahua Apache warrior who at this early point was serving closely with Cochise in this war. Later on, Victorio would break off on his own, and he would be the focus of large efforts to find and destroy his band. Many years later, he had a sister named Lozen, who was a warrior woman, and who was alleged to have had mysterious and supernatural powers to be able to predict danger. So she had like a spider sense. And after her brother died, she joined Geronimo's band and was one of his top lieutenants. The fighting that started in the incident that Chiricahuas still call Cut the Tent, when Cochise was attacked and made his escape, the war that started from that incident lasted until 1872, when Cochise finally came in and surrendered and agreed to go and live on a reservation, and then he died a couple of years later of cancer, actually. Geronimo did not surrender. Victorio did not surrender. And Geronimo, in fact, would keep fighting all the way up 25 years after that Cut the Tent incident, the late 1880s. But what we were just discussing, the first battle of Adobe Walls. Kit Carson was called away after that battle and wound up serving under General Carleton, who was in charge of the efforts to subdue the Apaches and Navajos in the Southwest. So there's a lot of incidents that happened. The Battle of Apache Pass in Arizona that pitted U.S. soldiers versus Apaches in a really large battle. The capture of the Navajos by Kit Carson, and then them being forced to walk, kind of like in a replay of the Trail of Tears, going the opposite direction, forced to walk to a very desolate reservation called the Bosque Redondo, where they basically starved for a while until they were allowed to go back to their own homeland. All of this stuff started at the beginning of the Civil War and is going on during that conflict. And the repercussions would continue for some time. So I wanted to at least mention Cochise and Geronimo, even though technically they were not Plains Indians, and most of this stuff happened just west of the Southern Plains.